The first thing Sylvia Hargrove said to me was that her son deserved better. Not to someone else, not behind my back, not softened into something that could be interpreted charitably, directly, to my face, in the entryway of her house on Meridian Drive on the evening my husband brought me home to meet his family for the first time. I was wearing the nicest dress I owned, which was navy blue with small buttons down the front that I had bought at a consignment shop 2 years earlier and had worn to every important occasion since because it was the only thing I had that felt like it belonged somewhere formal. I had pressed it that morning and I had done my hair carefully and I had practiced, in the mirror of the bathroom of the apartment I shared with my mother on the east side of the city, the particular expression of someone who is confident without being arrogant, warm without being desperate, the expression of a woman who belongs wherever she is standing. I had practiced it for 40 minutes. It did not survive the entryway. My name is Sarah Vance, and I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment on Carver Street where my mother, who was a home health aide, worked 6 days a week to keep us in a place with heat and a refrigerator that ran quietly enough to sleep through. We were not poor in the way that required charity, but we were poor in the way that required constant management, the mental arithmetic of every purchase, the particular discipline of wanting things and not getting them, the habit of looking at price tags before anything else that stays with you even when the circumstances change. I was the first person in my family to finish a 4-year degree, which I did at a state school on a combination of scholarships, loans, and the kind of part-time work schedule that leaves you perpetually slightly behind on sleep. I graduated with a degree in nursing, which was what I had chosen because it was stable and because I genuinely wanted to do it and because my mother had shown me, over 20 years of caring for other people, that it was work worth doing. I met James Hargrove at the hospital where I was in my 2nd year of nursing and he was visiting a colleague. He was not what I would have described as my type, if I had a type, which I am not sure I did. He was quiet in a way that could have read as standoffish but was actually, I learned, the quietness of someone who thought before speaking and didn't feel the need to fill every silence. He asked for my number at the end of a conversation that started because we were both waiting for the same elevator and ended 40 minutes later in the hospital cafeteria over terrible coffee that neither of us remarked on because we were too interested in each other to care about the coffee. I gave it to him. He called the next day, not after the calculated waiting period that some men observe, but the next actual day, which I respected. We dated for 18 months before he proposed. In those 18 months I met his sister, who was polite and essentially neutral in a way I understood as the behavior of someone withholding judgment until she had more information. I met his father, a large quiet man named Harold who shook my hand firmly and called me young lady and seemed genuinely interested in my work in a way that made me like him immediately. I did not meet his mother for 8 months, which I understood later was not an accident. James had been managing the timing, knowing something about the meeting that he had not fully prepared me for. When I finally met Sylvia, she was exactly what 8 months of careful management had made me slightly anxious about. She was the kind of woman who wore her wealth as a kind of language, the specific brands, the particular way she held herself, the ease of someone for whom money had been so long a constant that its presence was invisible to her in the way that water is invisible to fish. She was not ugly to me immediately, not in the first 10 minutes, she was cool, assessing, the way you assess something you are not sure of the value of and are taking your time to decide. It was when James left the room to help his father with something in the kitchen that she looked at me and said it. That her son deserved better. That she hoped I understood she was not a woman who could be charmed or managed. That James had a name to think about and a future to consider and that his choices had implications beyond what felt good in the moment. I said, very calmly, that I understood. I said it in the tone of a person who is declining to have the argument they have been invited to have. Not because they couldn't but because the moment was not right and there would be other moments. She looked at me with something that was not quite respect but was its nearest available neighbor, the look of someone who has thrown a punch and found that the other person did not fall. Then James came back and she became warm again in the particular seamless way of someone who has been performing warmth for decades and does it without effort. I married James 7 months later. The wedding was at his family's club, which Sylvia organized with an efficiency that would have been impressive if it had not consistently made me feel like a prop in her son's life rather than the person he was marrying. She chose the flowers. She chose the seating arrangement. She made suggestions about the dress that were technically suggestions and functionally directives, and I accommodated them because I loved James and I wanted the beginning of our marriage to have as little conflict as possible, and because I was 24 years old and I did not yet understand that accommodation without limit is not the same as patience. The 5 years that followed have a particular texture in my memory, not uniformly dark, because there were genuinely good things in them, but shadowed in the way of a room with a window that doesn't quite face the sun. James and I were happy in the ways that mattered most, which is to say in private, in the space of our own life together, the apartment we kept rather than moving into the family estate as Sylvia had suggested with the frequency of someone who considers repetition to be a form of persuasion. We disagreed about his mother with the careful restraint of people who love each other and are navigating something neither of them knows how to resolve. I would tell him, occasionally and with specific examples, what she did when he wasn't in the room, and he would believe me and feel terrible and talk to her and she would deny it gracefully and nothing would change. He was not a bad husband. He was a man whose mother was a very specific kind of difficult and who had spent his entire life developing strategies for managing her rather than confronting her, and those strategies did not work as well once there was another person in his life who was also being affected. Sylvia's tools were not loud ones. I want to be precise about this, as I have been precise about it before, because the loud cruelties are easier to document and defend against. She worked in the register of implication and omission. When the family gathered for Sunday dinners, which were non-negotiable in the Hargrove family, an institution rather than an invitation, she would organize the seating so that I was adjacent to conversations rather than inside them. She would compliment my cooking, when I brought dishes, with the particular phrasing that damns with faint praise, very creative, she would say, considering what you had to work with, and the second half of the sentence always arrived with a pause that gave it emphasis. She would refer to my family, when she referred to them at all, with a politeness that made their absence feel like a mercy rather than a loss. She bought me things for birthdays and holidays, always the right brands, always the right sizes, and the gifts were so perfectly chosen that they felt less like gifts and more like corrections, as if she were equipping me for the life she believed I was not yet adequate for. I continued working. This was the one area where Sylvia did not win, though not for lack of trying. She suggested, in the second year of our marriage, that it might be time to reconsider my schedule, that the hours were demanding, that now that James was doing well perhaps I didn't need to maintain the same pace. I told her, in the same tone I had used in the entryway on the first evening, that I loved my work and intended to continue it. She looked at me with the neighbor of respect expression again and let it go, at least in direct terms. In indirect terms she continued to raise it in various forms for the next 3 years, which I declined to engage with every time, politely, with a consistency that I think was the only language she actually understood. James's father died in the 4th year of our marriage, and the grief that followed changed the shape of things in ways that were hard to predict. Harold had been a moderating presence in the family, not a confrontational one, but solid, the kind of person whose steadiness keeps other things steady around them without anyone noticing until it's gone. After he died, Sylvia expanded in the way that certain people expand when the thing that contained them is removed, and the Sunday dinners became longer and more elaborate and more centered on her, and James became quieter in a way I associated with grief but that I now understand had other elements in it as well. It was in the 5th year that I discovered the financial situation. Not through anything dramatic, not through a letter or a confrontation, through a conversation at the hospital with a colleague whose husband worked in banking, who mentioned the Hargrove name in a context that did not match my understanding of the family's circumstances. I went home and I asked James, carefully, some questions I had not thought to ask before. The answers arrived over several conversations, each one adding to a picture that I had not been shown while I was inside it. Harold's business had been struggling before his death, in ways that Harold had managed privately and that James had only partially understood. After Harold died, the management had passed to James and to advisors Sylvia had chosen, and the decisions made in the year after Harold's death had accelerated a situation that was already difficult. There were debts. Significant ones. The estate that had seemed immovable, the house on Meridian Drive, the family accounts, the particular solidity of inherited wealth, was considerably more fragile than it appeared. By the time I understood the picture was nearly complete. Within 4 months of that first conversation with my colleague at the hospital, the house on Meridian Drive was being sold to meet obligations, and Sylvia was facing, for the first time in her adult life, the arithmetic of limited resources. James and I talked about what this meant for us over many evenings. The financial situation had not reached our own accounts. James had been careful to keep our finances separate from the family business in ways that turned out to protect us, but the emotional situation was harder to separate. James grieved his father's legacy. He felt responsible in ways I tried to address and could not fully reach. And Sylvia, losing the house that had been the physical expression of everything she had built her identity around, entered a period that I can only describe as the dismantling of a person who had never considered that dismantling was possible. She called me on a Thursday morning in March. Not James, me. The call was brief and the words were specific, and they were not easy for her, which I could hear in the spaces between them. She said she needed somewhere to stay while things were being sorted. She said she understood if I said no. She said she didn't have anywhere else to ask. I held the phone for a moment after she finished. I thought about the entryway on Meridian Drive and the navy dress with the buttons and the 5 years of Sunday dinners and the gifts that were corrections and the phrase "your son deserves better" said directly to my face while I stood there in the nicest thing I owned. I thought about all of it with a clarity that the years had given me, the kind of clarity that is not anger anymore but has passed through anger into something that can see more than anger allows. Then I told her she could come. She arrived the next morning with 2 suitcases, which was the reduced version of a life that had once required a house with 7 bedrooms. She stood in the doorway of our apartment, modest, well-kept, nothing like Meridian Drive, and she looked around with an expression I had not seen on her face in 5 years of knowing her. She looked uncertain. Not the performed uncertainty of someone making a point, but the real kind, the kind that lives in the face when the defenses that have been up so long they became architecture are suddenly, unexpectedly, no longer necessary. I showed her to the guest room. I had changed the sheets that morning and put flowers on the dresser because that is the person I am regardless of the circumstances, and I noticed her look at the flowers for a moment before she set down her bag. I made tea and we sat at my kitchen table, my table, in my home, a sentence I turned over quietly in my own mind, and we were both quiet for a while, the particular quiet of 2 people who have a great deal of history between them and are deciding what to do with it now that the landscape has changed. She said, eventually, what I had not expected her to say. She did not ease into it or approach it from an angle. She said she had been unkind to me. She said the word unkind the way someone says a word they have chosen carefully from several options, and I understood that unkind was the version she had arrived at after private consideration, and that it was not the entire word but it was the word she was able to say. She said she had been afraid of me, which surprised me enough that I asked her what she meant. She said she had been afraid of what I represented, not me specifically, but the version of the future I stood for, the one where her son chose someone she had not chosen, where the life she had built and the standards she had maintained turned out to matter less than she had believed. She said the fear had made her cruel in ways she had told herself were not cruelty at the time and had understood, since, were exactly that. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished I told her the truth, which was that what she had done had cost me more than she knew, that there were years I had spent questioning myself in ways I would not have spent without her voice in my head, that the Sunday dinners had been an ongoing exercise in managing something I should not have had to manage. I told her I was not going to perform forgiveness I didn't feel or accelerate a process that had its own pace. I told her she could stay for as long as she needed and that I would be decent to her, because decent was something I was regardless of what I was given in return, and that was where we were starting from. She nodded. She drank her tea. She looked at the flowers on the kitchen table. I kept flowers there, always, something James had teased me about early in our marriage and that I had continued regardless, and she said they were beautiful. I said thank you. It was the first uncomplicated exchange we had ever had. She stayed for 4 months. They were not easy months, but they were honest ones, which was something our relationship had never been before. She helped with things around the apartment in the way of someone who needed to contribute and did not know another way to express it. She was quiet in the mornings and present in the evenings, and she asked me questions about my work with a genuine curiosity that I suspected was partly the behavior of someone filling the hours of an unfamiliar life and partly something more real developing underneath. She came to the hospital once, to meet my colleagues, at my invitation, and she was warm to them in a way that cost her nothing and that I watched with the particular attention of someone seeing a person choose differently than they usually do. James watched all of this with the quietly stunned expression of a man whose wife and mother have reached a détente he had not believed was possible. He said to me one evening, when his mother was in the other room, that he did not know how I was doing it. I told him I was doing it the way I did everything, one day at a time, without expecting it to be easy, and without requiring it to be anything other than what it was. He said he should have protected me better. I told him that was probably true and that we would talk about it more when things were calmer and that right now I needed him to make dinner because I had worked a 12-hour shift. He made dinner. Sylvia found a small apartment 6 months after she came to us, in a building on the west side that was a significant adjustment from Meridian Drive and that she moved into with the particular quiet of someone who has made their peace with a new version of their life. She called me the day she moved in to tell me she had arrived safely, which was a call she would not have made a year earlier and which I understood as the cumulative result of 4 months of choosing differently. I asked if the apartment was comfortable. She said it was smaller than she was used to. I said smaller could be good. She said she was beginning to understand that. We have dinner together once a month now, the 3 of us, at a restaurant that is equidistant between her apartment and ours, chosen by rotation. The dinners are not the Sunday dinners on Meridian Drive, they are not elaborate or performative or organized around the expression of status. They are quiet dinners between 3 people who have, through various difficult routes, arrived at something honest. She calls me by my name, always, without qualifier. She asks about my work with specific follow-up questions that tell me she has listened to the previous conversation. She said once, over a meal, that no one had organized into a statement about anything, that I was nothing like what she had imagined when James brought me home that first evening, and that she wished she had understood sooner that this was not a criticism. I told her I had known exactly what she meant at the time and had decided not to let it be the last word. She looked at me for a moment and then she said she was glad. I am 30 years old. I have a husband I chose and a career I built and a home that is mine in every way that matters and a relationship with my mother-in-law that is not the relationship I would have designed but is honest, which turns out to be worth more than the designed version would have been. I have a daughter, 4 months old, who has her father's eyes and her grandmother Sylvia's hands, which is the kind of detail the universe occasionally produces that you either find meaningful or don't, and I find it meaningful. Sylvia held her at the hospital the day she was born. She held her carefully, the way people hold things they understand are precious and that they have been trusted with, and she looked down at this small new person and something in her face did the thing that Harold's face used to do at the dinners, the openness, the window coming up. She looked at me over the baby's head and she said thank you. I knew she did not only mean for the baby. I told her she was welcome. I meant it. She said that James deserved what he had. She did not say it as a statement about me. She said it as a statement about him, that he deserved the life he had built and the wife he had chosen and the daughter who had just arrived, and that she was grateful for all of it. It was the furthest possible distance from the entryway on Meridian Drive, and it had taken 5 years and a financial collapse and 4 months in a guest room to get there, and every step of the way I had been the person I decided to be rather than the person the circumstances kept suggesting I settle for. I did not need her to say it. I had not needed it for a long time. But I am glad she did, because it turns out that some words, even when they arrive late, are still worth having. And because my daughter was in her arms when she said it, which meant that the first thing my daughter heard her grandmother say, in the warm particular quiet of a hospital room on an April afternoon, was that the people who love her deserve exactly the life they have. I want her to grow up knowing that. I want her to know it the way I know it now, not as something she had to earn or prove or survive her way to, but as a simple and available fact, the kind that doesn't require anyone's permission to be true. That is the only thing Sylvia Hargrove ever gave me that I did not have already. And I am grateful for it, even so. Even so.